It's easy to look back now at the creation of Israel and think, well, it was almost inevitable, wasn't it? Especially looking through that 20th century lens.
Right. Hindsight makes it seem that way.
But let's rewind a bit. Picture the early 1800s, the entire global Jewish population, only about 2.5 million people. And here's the kicker, nearly 90% of them living right here in Europe.
It's quite a statistic, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you consider that concentration, the shift that happened later is just massive.
Totally. And then fast forward just over a century, and you see Zionism taking off, leading to a Jewish state, halfway across the world.
Exactly. And we've been digging into some really interesting sources, especially Walter Laqueur's big work, A History of Zionism.
Ah, Laqueur, yeah.
And he himself points out that's a huge task documenting all this. He mentions the Zionist archives in Jerusalem. Apparently, the shelves stretch for 2 miles.
2 miles. Wow. That really gives you a sense of the sheer volume of history there.
It does, just stacks and stacks of material.
Okay, so let's try and unpack some of this massive story. In this deep dive, our mission is really to pull out the key forces, the main players, and those really critical moments in early Zionism.
Mm.
We want to give you a clearer picture, basically, without getting totally lost in those 2 miles of archives.
Yeah, hit the main points, the crucial insights.
Exactly. So let's start at the beginning. What was life actually like for those Jews in Europe back in the early 19th century?
Well, if we take Germany as an example, they had around 200,000 Jews. Then you see this concentration, particularly in the east, in Posen.
Okay.
But what's really striking is most still lived rurally. Big cities like Berlin. Very few Jewish residents. I think it was barely 3,000 in 1815.
Just 3,000 in Berlin.
Yeah. And it wasn't by chance. Often the city guilds, the general population, they actively resisted Jewish settlement in the cities.
Right, so there were actual barriers.
Definitely. And that kind of limitation geographically, well, it obviously impacted their economic lives too.
Makes sense. So their movement was restricted, and I guess their job options were pretty narrow as well. The sources mention mostly small traders, middlemen. That sounds precarious.
Oh, very much so. It was a precarious existence for many. They were often, like you said, intermediaries, city to village, village to city, trading things like meat, wool, spirits, that kind of thing. In the parts that used to be Poland, you did have some Jewish artisans, but, their status was worlds away from the established city guilds with all their privileges.
Yeah.
It's quite telling. Moses Mendelssohn himself apparently said his son could realistically hope to be a physician, a trader, or, well, a beggar.
Wow. Stark choices.
Very stark.
But okay, things weren't completely static, were they? We start seeing the rise of these incredibly wealthy Jewish banking families. The Rothschilds are the obvious example.
That's a really important point. Yes, this very small but very influential financial elite starts to emerge.
Right, and that financial clout, even though it wasn't typical for most Jews, it did show this potential for international influence, didn't it? Something Zionists later tried to tap into.
Absolutely. It's noted, I think, in Berlin around 1807, there were actually more Jewish-owned banks than non-Jewish ones. And these families, they were giving massive loans to European governments all through that first half of the century.
So real power there.
Real financial power, yes. And this is crucial. We have to remember this was a tiny, tiny fraction of the Jewish population. A Jewish middle class was only just starting to form. The vast majority.
Yeah.
Still living in poverty.
Got it. So economically, socially, tough times for many. What about culturally, religiously? It's the 19th century, the Enlightenment's shaking things up. How did that play out?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. The Enlightenment, European culture, philosophy, art, literature, it had this huge allure. But the crisis of faith, which was affecting everyone, maybe hit Jews a bit differently or more acutely. Well, think about it. If you were, say, German or French, and you lost your religious faith, you still had your national identity, right? Your Germanness or Frenchness.
Okay, yeah.
But for a Jew, losing their faith back then, what was left, that national anchor wasn't really there in the same way. And traditional Judaism struggled to compete with Voltaire and Kant and all that.
So traditional religious authority was kind of losing its grip, especially for those getting a Western education. You mentioned earlier messianic movements fading too.
Exactly. The intense buzz around figures like Shabtai Zvi or the Frankists, that was long gone. Some followers had even converted out. And meanwhile, you had prominent rabbis in Germany often arguing amongst themselves, which didn't help their authority either.
Right.
So if you're a young Jew reading the Enlightenment thinkers, it's maybe not surprising you'd start looking at traditional practices with a bit of skepticism.
And amidst all this internal change, you still had the constant problem of anti-Semitism, right? It didn't just disappear with the Enlightenment's focus on reason. If anything, it seemed to take on new forms.
It did. Paradoxically, you get this intellectual backlash against the Enlightenment, and part of that includes this really deep-seated feeling that Jews were just fundamentally undesirable.
Undesirable.
Yeah. Figures like Fries were openly saying things like, asking townspeople, don't you hate these Jews who steal your livelihood and corrupt the German character? All this stuff.
Wow.
And Jewish intellectuals tried to fight back, with logic, pointing out Jewish contributions, the irrationality, the prejudice.
But as the source says, logic doesn't often work against that kind of deep, irrational hate, does it?
Sadly, no. The core of it was this profound aversion, this gut feeling that Jews as a group were a threat, even if individuals might be accepted here and there.
Yeah.
It made rational defense almost impossible.
So you've got this pull of European culture, weakening religious tradition, and this persistent, nasty anti-Semitism. It all seems to push towards assimilation, doesn't it? Especially in Western Europe.
Oh, absolutely. The draw of German, French, English culture was incredibly strong for those smaller, more spread out Jewish communities in the West. One Zionist later said something like 95% of their culture was basically Western European elements. They
Whoa.
really wanted to embrace emancipation fully.
But it wasn't always embraced back, was it? It sounds like it was often a one-sided effort.
Very much a one-way street. Jews were contributing massively in all sorts of fields, science, arts, finance. But the actual acceptance, the sort of societal reciprocation, it often fell way short of what they hoped for.
France is another interesting case, isn't it? People like Crémieux were fighting for Jewish rights, but they were also intensely French patriots, almost indifferent to Jewish history itself.
That's a great example. For many French Jews, being French came first, absolutely. They mourned French defeats, celebrated French victories. Jewish history, not really on their radar. Even someone like Bernard Lazare, who initially argued for total assimilation, basically the disappearance of Jews as a distinct group, even he eventually swung toward Zionism, which was incredibly rare.
A really unusual path.
Very unusual. For most, French identity was paramount.
Okay, so it's a picture of communities really trying to integrate, trying to belong in Europe, despite all the hurdles. Against that background, how did these very early ideas of maybe returning to Palestine even start to emerge?
Well, interestingly, even back in the 1840s, right when assimilation seemed strongest in the West, you do start seeing these various projects pop up advocating for some kind of Jewish return.
Okay.
And some of them were quite ingenious, showed real insight. Some even seemed almost prophetic later on. They were often tied into the whole Eastern question, the slow decline of the Ottoman Empire.
But Laqueur calls them romantic and artificial constructions. Why so dismissive? Sounds a bit harsh.
Well, I think the key reason is they lacked practicality. They lacked actual plans for implementation, and crucially, they lacked leaders willing to step up and make it happen.
Well, okay.
Often the authors didn't even put their names on these plans, which tells you something. And for Western Jews, remember, the main goal was still winning full rights in Europe. The idea of leaving that fight for, less developed region under Ottoman rule, it just didn't have mass appeal then.
So, good ideas maybe, but no real engine behind them.
Pretty much. They kept the idea alive, though. The idea of Palestine as the place, that's important. They articulated the need, even if they couldn't fulfill it yet.
Okay, so what about Moses Hess? His book, Rome and Jerusalem, from 1862, often gets mentioned as a really key early Zionist text.
It definitely is a landmark text. Hess himself is fascinating. He came from a religious background, then completely turned away from it. He apparently thought Judaism was basically dead, his historical mission done.
Wow, that's quite a statement from someone who then writes a foundational Zionist text.
Right. He even apparently mused that maybe Christianity was more relevant for modern times if you had to pick a religion.
Okay, so how did people react to Rome and Jerusalem when it first came out, given his views?
Well, like those earlier projects, Hess was way ahead of the curve initially. Almost zero impact, just fizzled.
Really?
Yeah, he got slammed by the Kulturjuden.
Can you just quickly explain Kulturjuden for us?
Sure. It generally means those assimilated, often highly educated Western European Jews who saw being Jewish more as a cultural heritage, maybe some ethical values, but not really a national identity or strict religious practice. They were very much invested in being German or French, etc.
Got it. So they weren't keen on Hess.
Not at all. Figures like Abraham Geiger, a big name in Reform Judaism, basically dismissed Hess as some kind of outsider trying to get attention with nationalism after his socialist ideas failed.
Ouch.
Yeah. And most socialists and liberals just ignored it or called it, romantic reactionary nonsense.
Yeah.
It really took decades for people to rediscover the book and see its political importance, even though Hess himself saw it more as philosophy.
So these early sparks in Western Europe, they didn't really catch fire immediately. Seems like the situation in Eastern Europe might have been more fertile ground.
Definitely a very different picture in the East. You had millions of Jews living in much larger, denser communities, right? The shtetls and larger towns, which made it easier to maintain their own distinct way of life, their Yiddish culture, traditions, folklore. And there wasn't that same overwhelming pull towards, say, Russian or Polish or Romanian culture,
Mhm.
which weren't seen as quite as advanced or alluring as German or French culture was in the West.
Right. And you see these major movements emerging there too, like Hasidism and the Haskalah. How do they feed into this developing national consciousness?
Well, Hasidism was this huge popular religious revival, very focused on piety, joy, that direct connection to God, quite different from the sort of drier, more intellectual rabbinic tradition.
Yeah.
It had massive appeal to the ordinary people, the masses, but maybe less so for the more enlightened types who were seeing all the changes happening around them. They're often more drawn to the
To
Haskalah.
the Jewish Enlightenment.
Exactly, which aimed to blend Jewish tradition with modern secular ideas. But again, it went in different directions.
How so? Different in the East compared to the West.
Yeah. In the West, as we saw, Haskell often just fed into assimilation. But in the East, while it also started with things like reviving Hebrew literature, some Haskell leaders realized that just wasn't enough. It wouldn't change the day-to-day lives of most Jews.
Right. They needed something more practical.
Exactly. So there was more emphasis on guiding Jews towards, more productive lives, modernizing education, but often still within their existing communities initially.
But the Haskalah faced pushback in the East too, didn't it? It wasn't all smooth sailing.
Oh, absolutely. Huge resistance. Not just from the Orthodox rabbis who were deeply suspicious of secular learning, but also from many ordinary Jews. They distrusted Western education, Western clothes, Western manners. All of it felt alien, maybe even threatening to their way of life.
So being an early Haskalah, that's the term for a Haskalah follower,
Wow.
right? Being one in a small Eastern European town must have been pretty tough.
Very isolating, yeah. Often ignored, sometimes actively opposed. A difficult path.
Okay, so in this kind of complex mix in the East, you get thinkers like Peretz Smolenskin, and he zeroes in on this idea of Jewish self-respect, or lack thereof, as being key to anti-Semitism.
Smolenskin's analysis was really interesting. He argued, yeah, anti-Semitism wasn't just about economic competition, though that was part of it.
Hmm.
More fundamentally, he thought it stemmed from the Jews' perceived lack of national pride, their low standing in the world's eyes.
Mm,
And for him, the Hebrew language was absolutely vital for survival. He famously said something like, without Hebrew, no Torah. Without Torah, no Jewish people.
powerful.
Yeah. And initially, he thought this national revival could happen in the diaspora. But later on, he shifted and started supporting immigration to Eretz Israel, setting up agricultural colonies there as the best way to rebuild that Jewish unity and self-respect.
And that leads us nicely to Leo Pinsker and his really important pamphlet from 1882, Auto-Emancipation. His own story is quite something, going from advocating assimilation to Zionism after the 1881 pogroms.
Pinsker's journey is dramatic, yeah. He was a respected doctor, a big proponent of cultural assimilation, Russification even. So for him to completely reverse course after seeing the brutality of the pogroms, it was a massive shock, a profound disillusionment.
You can imagine.
He basically realized his life's work promoting integration had been, well, useless in the face of that violence. And his pamphlet, Auto-Emancipation, it's this incredibly stark diagnosis. He talks about the anomaly of Jewish existence, Jews as this spiritual nation, but seen by the world as basically dead walking among the living.
Wow, strong language.
Incredibly strong. He argued Jews were guests everywhere, home nowhere, and their attempts to assimilate, to give up their own nationality, hadn't earned them real acceptance.
And he had this interesting take on why that rejection persisted, didn't he? Something about foreigners and Jews being the ultimate foreigner because they lacked a homeland.
Exactly. His point was, look, nobody really loves foreigners, right? But it's worse for Jews because they don't have a home country to offer hospitality from. Other foreigners might be guests, but they can also be hosts in their own land. The Jew, without a homeland, is perceived only as a beggar, never an equal guest.
That's a powerful, if bleak, analysis.
It is, and his conclusion was revolutionary for many at the time. Self-emancipation. Jews had to stop waiting for others to grant them rights and take their destiny into their own hands, create their own national home. That message, after the pogroms, really hit home for many.
Right. That failure of assimilation really created a vacuum, didn't it? Which brings us to the Lovers of Zion movement, the Hibbett Zion emerging right after those pogroms. This seems more like a grassroots thing.
It was definitely more spontaneous, yeah.
Yeah.
Directly sparked by the 1881-82 pogroms in Russia. You certainly had these emigration societies popping up independently in different cities, Suwałki, Kremenchug, various places in Poland.
And who was joining them?
A real mix, actually.
Yeah.
You had Orthodox Jews, traditionalists, but also radical students, some influenced by Russian populist ideas. Their immediate goals varied, too. Some were focused purely on getting people to Palestine right away. Others were more about supporting the few Jewish agricultural colonies already there.
Mm-hmm.
But initially, yeah, not much coordination between them.
And within that wider movement, you had the Bilu group, right? These students from Kharkov with that famous slogan, House of Jacob, come ye and let us go.
Yes, the Biluim. Their arrival in Palestine in the early 1880s is often called the first Aliyah, the first modern wave of immigration.
But it wasn't easy for them, was it?
Not at all. Their story really highlights the incredible hardships. Out of maybe 300 initial members, only a small number actually made it to Palestine. They tried setting up this sort of socialist-style commune, kind of a precursor to the kibbutz, worked at the Miki Israel Agricultural School, eventually founded the settlement of Jadera.
So some success, but tough.
Very tough. Small numbers. Immense difficulty. That was pretty much the typical experience for those very first settlers. They also faced huge practical problems just getting land, right? It was expensive, and the Ottoman authorities often put up roadblocks to Jewish ownership. That added another whole layer of difficulty.
Definitely. So the Lovers of Zion laid some groundwork, built some small settlements, but it feels like it was really Theodor Herzl who kicked things into high gear politically, starting around 1896. His time as a journalist in Paris, seeing the Dreyfus Affair. That seems key.
Oh, the Dreyfus Affair was absolutely pivotal for Herzl. It just shattered his belief, and he held it quite strongly that assimilation was the answer to anti-Semitism.
Seeing it happen in supposedly enlightened France.
Exactly. That raw public anti-Semitism in Paris pushed him to write Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state.
And how was that received initially?
Well, amongst the established Jewish leadership, particularly in the West, mostly ridicule, hostility, or just dismissal, they thought he was naive, maybe even dangerous, stirring things up. But despite that initial reaction, the book just completely changed the conversation. It put the idea of a Jewish state, political self-determination, right on the table in a way it hadn't been before.
And Herzl himself went through this incredible change, didn't he? From this Vienna intellectual, this literary figure, to a full-on political activist.
A remarkable transformation. He threw himself into it completely. Reports say he sacrificed his marriage, his money, his health, everything for the cause.
Wow.
He went from being this respected writer to this relentless organizer, diplomat, leader. Even while, being pretty clear-eyed about the challenges, he had that famous, maybe slightly cynical line about his early followers being an army of schnorrers, basically beggars.
Shows the struggle.
That he knew he was starting almost from scratch in terms of resources.
And the big culmination of those initial whirlwind years was the first Zionist Congress in Basel, 1897. That seems like the moment Zionism really became a formal political movement. That was pretty new for Jews in the diaspora, wasn't it? Creating this kind of formal international body.
Absolutely groundbreaking. The Basel Congress was the turning point. It officially created the Zionist organization, and crucially, it adopted the Basel Program.
Which stated the aim clearly.
Yes, to create a publicly and legally assured home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Very deliberate wording.
Publicly and legally assured.
Right. And they set up the structure, the executive committee, the action committee, to actually do the work. And it wasn't just political aims. Ideas that became huge later were floated there too. A Zionist bank for land purchase, a Hebrew university.
So practical steps too.
Exactly. And the reports from the Congress, the sheer gratitude people felt towards Herzl for pulling it all together, for giving this scattered hope a concrete form, it was immense. He really did unify disparate threads into a political force.
So after Basel, Herzl really hits the diplomatic trail, doesn't he? Trying to get the big European powers on board. How did that go?
Well, he was incredibly energetic, meeting with emperors, sultans, ministers.
Yeah.
But the actual results during his lifetime, pretty limited, honestly. He faced huge hurdles trying to get Germany, Russia, or especially the Ottoman Empire, to actively support the plan.
Any specific examples?
His meeting with the Russian ministers, Pleve and Witt, is quite something. Pleve, who's behind pogroms, apparently spoke very bluntly to Herzl about the problem of Russian Jews, their involvement in revolution. Herzl was impressed by his frankness, weirdly enough.
Strange bedfellows.
Very. And Herzl later wrote in his diary comparing himself to Columbus, facing a mutinous crew, land nowhere in sight. It shows the pressure he was under.
Yeah. And then there was the whole Uganda scheme controversy, right? Offering territory in East Africa.
Ah, yes, the Uganda proposal from the British. That caused a massive split within the Zionist movement itself. Herzl saw it maybe as a temporary refuge, a night shelter, but for many, especially the Eastern Europeans.
Palestine was the only option.
Absolutely. The emotional historical tie to Palestine was just too strong. The debate nearly tore the movement apart, but ultimately it reinforced that Palestine was the non-negotiable goal.
Okay, so Herzl's big diplomatic push didn't immediately yield a state. And after he died relatively young, in 1904, there seems to have been a shift in strategy towards something called practical Zionism.
That's right. After Herzl's death, the focus within the movement gradually shifted. The thinking became less about achieving a state through one big diplomatic coup and more about building the foundations in Palestine brick by brick.
So less focus on getting international charters right away.
Less focus on that being the only path. Practical Zionism emphasized the slow, steady work. Buying land, establishing settlements, farms, villages, eventually towns, creating Jewish institutions, building an economic base. The idea was basically create facts on the ground.
Build it and they will come, or build it and the political recognition will follow.
Something like that, yeah. The belief was that this practical work, this colonization, was the essential groundwork needed before political sovereignty could become a reality.
But even though his grand plan didn't happen overnight, Herzl's impact, it was still huge, wasn't it? His legacy.
So undeniable. Absolutely profound. Even if the practical Zionists took over the day-to-day settlement work, Herzl did something transformative. He took all these scattered ideas, cultural revival, philanthropy, vague hopes, and forged them into a single, focused political movement aiming for national self-determination in Palestine.
He gave it structure and direction.
And hope. He gave hundreds of thousands of Jews, especially in Eastern Europe, who felt trapped and desperate, a sense of confidence, a political goal, and he resonated in the West, too, with those feeling marginalized. Crucially, he put the Jewish question onto the international stage in a way it hadn't been before. He laid the groundwork for everything that followed, including, eventually, the Balfour Declaration.
Right. Now, within this growing movement, it wasn't all one unified bloc, was it? You had different thinkers, different ideological streams emerging, people like Ahad Haham, Martin Buber, Berdichevsky, offering quite different visions.
Definitely not monolithic.
Yeah.
Ahad Haham is a key figure here with his cultural Zionism. He was actually quite critical of the early settlement efforts, the practical Zionists to some extent. He wrote an essay called The Wrong Way.
The wrong way. What was wrong with it, in his view?
He felt they were too focused on just physically being there, on numbers and land, without enough attention to the spirit. He argued the priority should be creating a spiritual and cultural center in Palestine, reviving Hebrew, Jewish culture, philosophy, that had to come first, or at least alongside, any political project.
So culture before politics, or as the foundation for politics.
More the foundation. He differed quite strongly from Herzl's focus on getting political charters immediately. Ahad Haham's influence on Hebrew culture was immense, but some critics felt he maybe downplayed the urgent physical need for a refuge for persecuted Jews.
Interesting tension. And then Martin Buber, he brings a more philosophical, almost spiritual dimension, doesn't he?
Buber's vision was quite unique. He saw the return to Eretz Israel as this opportunity for Jews to fulfill a special spiritual mission, connecting humanity, nature, the divine, building a society based on dialogue, community, shared work. Very idealistic.
And how much impact did that have on the actual politics?
Less direct political impact, perhaps.
Yeah.
His ideas resonated more with certain intellectuals, especially maybe Western Jews looking for spiritual meaning. But for the Jews facing pogroms in Eastern Europe, his talk about the Asian character of Judaism and building this utopian community maybe felt a bit abstract compared to the immediate dangers they faced.
Right, different priorities. And then you have Micah Yosef Berdichevsky, who sounds much more radical, calling for a complete break with tradition.
Berdichevsky was definitely radical. He basically wanted a total transformation, a rejection of much of rabbinic tradition, which he saw as a product of the unhealthy diaspora experience. He called for a rebirth, Jews becoming Hebrews again, connected to the land, to physical life, rejecting what he saw as diaspora passivity.
Wow. So tear it all down and start again.
Pretty much. He wanted the current generation to be the founders of a completely new nation. His ideas did have some influence, particularly on labor Zionism, the kibbutz emphasis on manual labor, creating a new Jew. But initially, his wholesale rejection of the past was too much for many, though his questions about Jewish identity became very relevant later, once Israel was established.
Okay, so lots of different ideas swirling around. Let's jump forward now to 1917 and that hugely significant moment, the Balfour Declaration. What were the key things that actually led to the British government issuing the statement supporting a Jewish national home?
It was really a convergence of several things. First, you had years of persistent, skillful lobbying by Zionist leaders, especially in the Allied countries. Think Louis Brandeis in the U.S., who had President Wilson's ear.
Right.
And then Shane Weissman in London was absolutely crucial. He was brilliant at framing Zionist aims as being aligned with British strategic interests in the post-Ottoman Middle East.
So strategic calculations were part of it?
Definitely a part, but maybe not the whole story.
Hmm.
Arthur Balfour himself, the Foreign Secretary, seems to have had this genuine personal conviction, a belief that a historic wrong had been done to the Jewish people and that Britain owed them a debt. He apparently saw Jews as this incredibly gifted people who'd suffered immensely.
So a mix of strategy and maybe some genuine sympathy or historical view.
It seems like it. But you're right to be cautious about altruism. The whole picture is complicated by things like the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, those earlier ambiguous British promises to the Arabs about independence after the war. Did Palestine fall into those promises? It was unclear and became a major source of conflict later.
Yeah, that ambiguity had massive consequences.
Interestingly, though, by the time the declaration was actually issued, the U.S. had already entered the war. So the argument that Britain needed to woo American Jewish support purely for the war effort maybe wasn't as strong by late 1917. It suggests other factors like Balfour's views or Weizmann's diplomacy were also really important.
And wasn't there significant opposition within the British Jewish community itself? Not everyone was on board with Zionism.
Absolutely. Very prominent figures, often from the older, highly assimilated Anglo-Jewish establishment groups like the Conjoint Committee, were strongly opposed.
Why? What were their concerns?
Their main fear was dual loyalty. They worried that supporting a Jewish national home elsewhere might undermine their status as loyal British citizens, casting doubt on their integration.
Oh, okay.
But this establishment opposition gradually lost ground. Support for Zionism was growing among ordinary British Jews, and there were internal power struggles within the community leadership. The old guard found themselves increasingly out of sync.
So public opinion was shifting, and mobilizing Jewish opinion in the Allied countries generally helped create the right climate, presumably. What about Russia? That was a major power and had a huge Jewish population.
Russia was complicated. After the Tsar fell, the provisional government was generally sympathetic to Zionism. But frankly, they had bigger problems: the war, the revolution brewing. Palestine wasn't top of their list.
Understandable.
And Russian Zionists themselves were a bit wary of aligning too closely with Britain, given Britain's past dealings with the Tsar. Plus, there were doubts about whether Britain could even win the war in the Middle East. So while there wasn't active opposition from the provisional government, there wasn't a clear, strong endorsement like they got from Britain either.
Okay. So despite the complexities, the internal dissent, the Balfour Declaration happens, but almost immediately you see Arab opposition flare up, laying the seeds for the conflict to come. This wasn't totally new, though, was it?
No, not entirely new. We mentioned earlier, even back in 1891, you had Arab notables in Jerusalem petitioning the Ottomans, complaining about Jewish land buying and influence. So the underlying tensions were there.
What fueled that early opposition?
It was a mix. Some of it was stoked by Christian clergy in Palestine, who saw the Zionists as rivals. You also had European anti-Semitic literature filtering into some Arab newspapers. And while some poorer Muslims might have benefited economically from Jewish settlement and been okay with it, the Christian Arabs, who were often at the forefront of early Arab nationalism, tended to be more consistently hostile.
And within the Zionist movement itself, how were they thinking about relations with the Arabs? Were there different approaches?
Yes, there were definitely voices advocating for cooperation. People like Alexander Eliasberg pointed to the shared Semitic roots, the language connections, and hoped for collaboration, maybe even building a shared Palestinian culture.
Sounds optimistic.
It was. But those views often got drowned out by a more general tendency within Zionism, especially before World War I, to seriously underestimate the strength and potential of Arab nationalism.
A blind spot.
A significant one in retrospect. Opportunities for real dialogue were missed. Even when someone like Naum Sokolow tried to reassure people by saying Zionists wanted a Heim state, a national home, not necessarily a state right away, it didn't really calm Arab fears about the future, about large-scale Jewish immigration changing the whole dynamic of the country.
So they failed to see how strong Palestinian Arab identity and connection to the wider Arab world would become.
Largely, yes. There was a failure to anticipate the growth of the Arab population and the depth of their connection to the land and the emerging Arab national movements elsewhere.
What about key figures? How did someone like Ben-Gurion view the possibility of agreement early on?
Early on, Ben-Gurion sometimes expressed a kind of long-term optimism that an understanding could eventually be reached, but he's often quite pessimistic about dealing with the existing Arab leadership in the short term.
And then you had others like Judah Magnus and the Brit Shalom Group who were much more worried about conflict.
Yes, Magnus and Brit Shalom were sounding the alarm very early on about the Arab question. They warned forcefully against policies that could lead to violence and advocated for a binational state,
How were their views received?
often very critically within the mainstream Zionist movement. They are sometimes accused of having a diaspora mentality, of lacking national resolve.
Ouch. What did Weissman think?
Weissman had a more nuanced view. He wasn't entirely unsympathetic to their concerns, but he seemed to believe it would take a long, slow process for Zionists themselves to fully grasp the reality of the Arab presence and the need for compromise.
And Haim Arlusarov, another key labor Zionist leader.
Arlusarov's views evolved, but ultimately became quite pessimistic about the chances of reaching a genuine, lasting agreement with the Palestinian Arab leadership, certainly in the foreseeable future. He saw a clash as perhaps unavoidable.
Okay, turning now to the waves of immigration, the Aliyot. The second Aliyah, roughly 1904 to 1914, brought a very different type of immigrant, didn't it? These young idealists from Eastern Europe. How did they change things, especially with the rise of labor Zionism?
The second Aliyah was hugely significant. Yeah, these were mostly young, often unmarried men and women coming from Russia and Poland. Lower middle-class backgrounds often, but deeply ideological. They weren't primarily fleeing persecution in the same way some earlier immigrants might have been. They were coming to build a new society.
A socialist society based on labor.
Exactly. They were fired up by socialist ideals, the idea of creating an egalitarian Jewish community through manual work, working the land. They were the Halutzim.
Halutzim the pioneers.
Right. They embraced the hard physical labor, the tough conditions in Palestine, almost as a religious duty, a way to redeem the land and themselves. But they often had zero farming experience.
So ideology met harsh reality.
Pretty much. Adapting to backbreaking agricultural work was incredibly difficult. And they also clashed ideologically with the folks from the first Aliyah, the Biluim.
How so?
Well, by this time, many of the first Aliyah settlers had become landowners, employers. So in the eyes of these new socialist arrivals, they were now the class enemy.
Ah, okay. Created instant tension.
Definitely. And this tension, combined with their own struggles, really fueled the beginnings of an organized labor movement in Palestine. The arrival of a group from Nablus around 1904 is often seen as a key moment. Immigration picked up significantly then, too.
But conditions were still awful.
Terrible. Primitive housing, rampant malaria, and crucially, not enough work. Jewish landowners often found it cheaper and easier to hire experienced Arab workers.
So the Halutzim couldn't even get jobs?
Often, no. It led to real debates within the Zionist movement. Should we even be encouraging more people to come if there's no work and conditions are this bad?
Difficult dilemmas. But key institutions still emerged from this period, like Hashomer, the Defense Organization, and the beginnings of the kibbutz.
Yes. Hashomer grew out of earlier, more local self-defense efforts. It became a more organized group protecting Jewish settlements. And A.D. Gordon, his philosophy of the religion of labor, the spiritual value of working the land, was hugely influential for the whole second Aliyah generation, even if a practical guys in Hashomer maybe found it a bit abstract sometimes.
Right.
And the kibbutz movement started then too. Small beginnings, lots of trial and error, but gradually it grew, developing its unique communal lifestyle, its own educational ideas, eventually leading to the big Kibbutz Artsy Federation in the late 20s.
And the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, that must have sent ripples through socialist Zionism, too.
Oh, absolutely. It threw a huge spanner in the works for many left Zionists. Their whole ideology was often based on the idea that the Jewish problem was tied to capitalism.
So if Russia goes socialist...
Exactly. The Soviets formally abolished legal discrimination against Jews, promised equality. So some started asking, do we still need to go to Palestine? Maybe the solution is here, in the socialist motherland.
Created a split.
A major split in the Zion movement. Some factions eventually ended up trying to work within the communist system through those Jewish sections, the Yevsektia, which didn't end well for most of them, unfortunately.
And then in 1920, you get the founding of the Histadrut, the big labor federation in Palestine. What was its aim?
The Histadrut was founded to be this big umbrella organization for all Jewish workers in Palestine, trying to overcome some of those political splits. Its goals were really broad: organize labor, run the immigration office, set up a workers' bank, provide health care, build industries, basically to be the economic and social backbone of the Yishuv.
The Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine before Israel.
Exactly. And despite facing huge challenges like mass unemployment early on, the Histadrut grew incredibly fast and became massively powerful.
And the leaders from that second Aliyah, they stayed influential.
Very much so. Even when later waves of immigrants, the third Aliyah, arrived and there were tensions, the leadership cadre that came out of the second Aliyah really dominated the issue's political and economic life for decades. It's striking how many of them came from just a few small towns in Belarus and Ukraine.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move to the fourth Aliyah, mid-1920s. This sounds like another shift in who was coming, triggered by problems in Poland.
Yes, the fourth Aliyah, 1924-26, was different again, largely prompted by anti-Jewish economic legislation in Poland under Grabski. So the people coming weren't mostly the young socialist halutzim of the second and third Aliyah.
Who were they then?
More middle class, small shopkeepers, traders, artisans, families, fleeing economic hardship more than driven by pioneering ideology.
And where did they go? Did they head for the agricultural settlements?
Mostly no. They tended to concentrate in the cities, especially Tel Aviv, which just exploded in size, and Haifa too. This led to a bit of an economic boom initially, lots of optimism.
But what kind of boom?
That was the problem. It was heavily based on land speculation and construction, especially in Tel Aviv. Not so much on building solid industry or expanding agriculture.
And how did the established labor movement, the Histadrut folks, feel about this wave?
They were pretty uneasy about it. They saw it as importing a bourgeois element, people less committed to socialist ideals and manual labor. They worried it would change the character of the yishuv.
And did the boom last?
No, it burst spectacularly around 1926-27. The speculation collapsed, leading to a severe economic crisis, mass unemployment, and actually quite significant emigration out of Palestine for a while.
So a setback. Now, throughout this period, we also have the rise of revisionist Zionism, very much associated with Vladimir Jabotinsky. How did his vision differ from the mainstream, especially labor Zionism?
Jabotinsky started out with some socialist sympathies, but he diverged pretty sharply later on. He was deeply critical of what he saw as the Zionist leadership's overly cautious, maybe even timid, approach economically, socially, politically.
What did he advocate instead?
A much more assertive stance. He insisted on the goal being a Jewish state, explicitly, on both sides of the Jordan River. He called for mass colonization, backed by international guarantees, and a much tougher line with the British and the Arabs. Basically, less focus on slow settlement and socialist experiments, more on achieving political sovereignty quickly.
And that led to a formal split.
Yes. He formed the revisionist movement and party, which became the main opposition to the labor-dominated Zionist establishment. And later, even more radical groups, like the Ergun and then Lehi Stern Gang, split off from the revisionists, believing even Jabotinsky wasn't militant enough.
Okay. Now, we've talked about different strands within Zionism, but it's crucial to remember not all Jews were Zionists. We mentioned the assimilated opposition earlier. What about the Orthodox communities, especially groups like Agudat Israel?
Agudat Israel represented a significant stream of Orthodox Judaism that was fundamentally anti-Zionist right from the start.
On what grounds?
Primarily religious. They believed that the Jewish exile could only be ended and the Jewish people restored to the land of Israel, through divine intervention, the coming of the Messiah. They saw Zionism as a secular, human attempt to force God's hand, which was forbidden.
So it's seen as heresy, almost.
By many, yes. They also objected strongly to the secular nature of the Zionist project, things that violated Jewish law, halakha like giving women the vote, or the Zionist leadership not submitting to rabbinic authority on public matters.
Did they cooperate at all on settlement, for instance?
There were some very limited, pragmatic instances where they might support Orthodox settlement efforts done in a traditional way. But overall, their stance was deeply antagonistic. They often allied with assimilationist Jews against the Zionists. Some Orthodox leaders used incredibly harsh language about Herzl and the movement. The assassination of Jacob Israel Dahan in Jerusalem in 1924, an Aguda activist who was negotiating with Arab leaders, allegedly by the Haganah, shows how high tensions ran.
Right. And then there was opposition from socialist movements outside Zionism, too. Marxists, for example.
Yes, many traditional Marxist thinkers had a different analysis entirely. They tended to see the Jewish question, anti-Semitism, Jewish marginalization as a byproduct of capitalism.
So the solution wasn't a Jewish state, but
Socialism. A world socialist revolution would, in theory, eliminate class divisions and national conflicts, and thus solve the Jewish problem along with everything else. Thinkers like Karl Kautsky specifically critiqued Zionism as impractical utopian, facing impossible hurdles like finding land and turning urban Jews into farmers.
how widespread was this view?
Pretty dominant in major socialist parties before World War I. The powerful German Social Democrats were largely hostile. French and British socialist views were mixed, but often negative or indifferent.
Even the rise of Nazism didn't immediately convert all socialists or assimilated Jews to Zionism.
Not immediately, no. It's hard to grasp now, but the source mentions figures like Alfred Zuckerman, a German Jew deeply rooted in German culture, expressing total disbelief initially, rejecting the idea of emigration. The attachment to their home countries was incredibly strong for many, and the Soviet Union's position on Jews and Zionism was always complex, shifting, often suspicious, and ultimately aimed at control, not independent Jewish nationalism.
Okay, let's move into the Mandate period proper, after World War I. Things seem to really escalate. That British White Paper of 1939 sounds like a major turning point.
It was a bombshell. The 1939 White Paper basically slammed the door on the core promise of the Balfour Declaration. It imposed drastic, almost complete limits on future Jewish immigration and land purchases in Palestine. It essentially signaled Britain was abandoning the idea of a Jewish national home becoming a state.
How did the Zionist movement react?
With outrage, obviously. And it led to a hardening of their own position. The Biltmore program, adopted by American Zionists in 1942, is key here. It marks a shift away from just talking about a national home to explicitly demanding Palestine be established as a Jewish commonwealth, basically, a state.
And this is all happening against the backdrop of rising Nazism and then the Holocaust?
Exactly. Jewish immigration to Palestine had already surged in the 1930s as Jews fled persecution in Europe. Then came the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 39 against the British and Zionist settlement, and then the Holocaust.
Which must have just fundamentally changed everything for Zionism.
Absolutely. The systematic murder of 6 million European Jews. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was proof, in the eyes of Zionists and many other Jews, that a sovereign Jewish state was not just desirable, but an absolute necessity for survival. The failure of the Allies to do more to rescue Jews during the war just hammered that point home.
So after the war, when Britain under the Labour government under Ernest Bevin largely stuck to the White Paper restrictions.
That created an impossible situation. You had Holocaust survivors desperate to get to Palestine, the Zionist movement determined to bring them in, and the British blocking them. It led to illegal immigration, clashes, the whole post-war conflict with Britain.
And we see the center of Zionist political gravity shifting too, away from London.
Definitely towards the United States.
Oh.
American Zionists had become much more influential, and the U.S. was emerging as the dominant world power. Zionist leaders increasingly looked to Washington and ultimately to the new United Nations to break the deadlock.
Which brings us to the UN Partition Plan in 1947. How did that come about, and what was the reaction?
Facing an intractable mess, Britain handed the Palestine problem over to the UN. The UN proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem internationalized.
Was it universally accepted by Zionists?
Not universally, no. There was intense debate. Some, particularly on the revisionist right, rejected it because it didn't give them all of Palestine, especially Jerusalem, but the mainstream leadership under Ben-Gurion decided to accept it as the best achievable compromise, a crucial step towards statehood.
And crucially, it got international backing, including from an unexpected source.
Yes, the plan passed the UN General Assembly in November 1947, and the real surprise, and absolutely vital for its passage, was the support of the Soviet Union and its bloc.
Why did the Soviets support it after decades of being anti-Zionist?
Geopolitics, mainly. They likely saw it as a way to weaken British influence in the Middle East and maybe gain a foothold themselves. It was a strategic move, but it was decisive in getting the necessary votes.
So the UN plan passes. Britain announces it's leaving in May 1948. What happens then?
The Yishuv leadership moved incredibly fast. They set up a provisional government, a national council, preparing to declare independence the moment the mandate ended. This was happening even as civil war between Jews and Arabs intensified following the partition vote, and with clear warnings from the U.S. State Department that if they declared a state and were attacked by Arab armies, they shouldn't expect American military help.
A huge gamble.
An immense gamble, taken in the shadow of the Holocaust and the belief that this was their only chance.
So if we zoom out and look back at this whole complex story, Zionism wasn't just one thing, was it? It arose from this incredibly complicated mix of factors.
Absolutely. You've got the precariousness of Jewish life in Europe, centuries of anti-Semitism constantly shifting its shape, the pull of assimilation versus the yearning for national revival, religious motivations, socialist ideals, all driven by these incredibly dedicated, sometimes conflicting individuals and movements.
And a path wasn't smooth. Constant challenges, bitter internal arguments, and obviously growing opposition from the Arab population, leading to tragic conflict.
It's true. And thinking about surprising aspects, maybe it's that initial reluctance, even hostility, from so many assimilated Western Jews. They saw themselves as German or French first.
Right. That's striking. Or, as you mentioned, the Soviet Union's sudden switch to supporting partition in '47. Politics makes strange bedfellows indeed.
It certainly does.
And understanding all this history, the twists and turns, the different viewpoints, it really does provide such crucial context for making sense of the region today, doesn't it?
You simply can't understand the present without grappling with this past. It shows how history, ideology, individual choices, how they all intertwine to shape nations, for better or worse.
So maybe a final thought to leave you, the listener, with. Considering all those different visions within early Zionism, Ahad Ham's cultural focus, Herzl's political drive, Buber's spiritual quest, Berdichevsky's radical break, the socialist pioneers, the revisionists.
A whole spectrum of ideas.
Exactly. How might things have turned out differently if one of those other paths, maybe one less focused on immediate statehood or more focused on binationalism, had actually gained more traction early on? It makes you think about the what-ifs of history, doesn't it? And the lasting impact of the choices that were made back then.